I didn't cry when the doctor looked me in the eye and said the 3 words that would change everything. You have cancer. I didn't cry when the hair started falling, or when I quietly slid a medical leave request into my manager's inbox like it was something to be ashamed of. I didn't cry when the emails from HR became shorter, colder, like I was a line item they were preparing to erase. But I did cry the night I watched the video my son recorded at my father's 70th birthday party, the one I had promised to attend, the one I missed with just a single text. Daddy, I'm sorry. I had to work. My name is Helen Graves. I'm 56 years old, and until recently, I was the lead data solutions architect at Brightcore Analytics, a fast-growing tech firm in Denver. You wouldn't have seen my face on the company newsletter. I didn't speak at conferences or pose for press photos, but when the systems went down, when the big clients got mad, when a deadline loomed like a storm eye was the one they called, I wasn't young. I didn't scroll TikTok or sip those 3-layer cold brews like the fresh grads in marketing. But I had something they didn't. Experience, resilience, and quiet dedication. And maybe that's why, when our CEO, Evan Merrill, asked to see me one Thursday afternoon, I thought just maybe they were finally recognizing my worth. He told me they were chasing a multi-million-dollar deal with a healthcare provider. It was confidential, high stakes, and he needed someone he could trust. Helen, he said, lowering his voice like it was something sacred, if you pull this off, it might just be the last job you'll ever need to do. I smiled not out of arrogance, but because I truly believed he saw me. I believed, after years of carrying the weight of this company in silence, that someone finally understood what I brought to the table. I didn't ask for paperwork. I should have. But I had just started chemotherapy and still stayed up until 3 a.m. building data models. I worked through Thanksgiving. I missed Christmas dinner. Every time I opened Zoom, I applied a little concealer to hide the exhaustion and the bruises. No one at work knew I was sick. I didn't want pity. I didn't want to be replaced. I kept telling myself, once this project is over, I'll rest, I'll breathe, I'll live again. But people like me, we keep putting off life until after the work is done. And sometimes after the work is done, never comes. In the months that followed that conversation with Evan, I gave the company more than just my time. I gave it pieces of my life I'll never get back. I was battling stage 2 lymphoma quietly, with no one at Brightcore aware that I was spending my lunch breaks in my car injecting myself with medication, or that my calendar blocks marked client research were really appointments at the infusion center. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want them to see me differently, and most of all, I didn't want to give them a reason to move on without me. The project codenamed Argus, a massive data integration platform for a private medical network spanning 6 states. The contract was hush-hush. The stakes were sky-high, and the pressure was unrelenting. I built everything from the ground up, the back-end architecture, the encryption layers, the real-time patient data protocols. I rewrote legacy code, stitched together third-party APIs, and manually QA'd the smallest bugs when the junior team burned out. And yet, somehow, I told myself that it was all worth it because if I could just get through it, just finish this one project, maybe they'd finally stop overlooking me. I remember one particular night in February. Denver was deep in snow, and I had been at the office for nearly 17 hours. I hadn't eaten since morning, and my skin was flushed from the chemo. I leaned back in my chair, legs tingling, heart fluttering with a strange, persistent tightness that I told myself was just stress. My phone buzzed on the desk, 2 missed calls from my son, and a video. He had just finished his piano recital. I watched the shaky cliff of his small fingers hitting the keys, his eyes scanning the crowd, searching. He ended his performance, smiled at someone, then turned the camera to whisper, "That one was for you, Mom." I put the phone down and just sat there, frozen. I couldn't remember the last time I had clapped for him in person. Still, I showed up the next morning at 6:45 a.m., logging on before anyone else, compiling usage logs, running simulations, preparing for the weekly status call with Evan like I wasn't falling apart inside. No one asked why I looked pale. No one noticed the scarf I wore despite the heating. That's the thing about being reliable, people. Stop checking if you're okay, because you're always the one making sure everyone else is. Weeks passed, then months. I missed Easter dinner with my siblings, my niece's baby shower, and the annual church retreat my father still leads every spring. I turned down every invitation, every call, every reminder of the world I used to belong to because I had convinced myself this sacrifice was temporary, that if I just gave enough, they'd finally see me. But the truth is, I wasn't invisible because of my illness or my age. I was invisible because I had allowed myself to be. And the more I gave, the more they quietly took. The final stages of the Argus build were the most brutal. I barely slept, surviving on black coffee and over-the-counter painkillers. I held training calls with the sales team, wrote the internal documentation, and even coached Lucas, the young developer they'd recently hired through the user interface specs, thinking I was mentoring the next generation. He was polite, eager to learn, and constantly asking questions I was more than happy to answer, never suspecting that the very knowledge I was handing him would soon be used to erase me. When we finally delivered the finished product clean, functional, and months ahead of schedule, I remember looking at the dashboard and feeling nothing but exhaustion. There was no champagne toast, no email from Evan, not even a simple well done, just silence. And in that silence, something in me began to fracture. I had lost weight. My oncologist warned me my blood counts were dangerously low and recommended I take a full leave. But how do you take a break when your worth feels like it hangs on proving you're still strong? How do you rest when the thing you've built could be taken the moment you stop guarding it? So I kept showing up, even as the fatigue deepened, even as my hair thinned and my vision blurred. I smiled through meetings, even when the tremors in my hands made it hard to type. I told myself, just one more week, then just until deployment, then just until the investor showcase. But just until turned into never enough. And all the while, I watched as my name disappeared from the internal briefs. The weekly updates shifted credit to team efforts. Lucas started fielding client calls without me. When I gently asked Evan if I was being looped out intentionally, he brushed it off with a laugh. "You've done your part, Helen. Let the team take it from here." His words stung in a way I hadn't expected, not because I wanted the spotlight, but because I had given up so much just to be part of something I believed in. Looking back now, I realized that silence isn't just absence, it's strategy. And I had mistaken my silence for strength, when in fact, it was complicity. 3 weeks after we launched the Argus platform, 3 weeks after I gave everything I had left in me to deliver a project that should have cemented my legacy, I noticed the first crack. It came not with a bang, but with a silence so deliberate it was deafening. Evan stopped replying to my update emails. Our scheduled check-ins disappeared from the calendar without explanation. The promised performance bonus, the one he had dangled in our quiet meeting as a reward for loyalty and grit, never arrived. At first, I thought maybe the paperwork had been delayed, that finance was simply catching up with year-end chaos. I gave it a few more days, then a week, but the silence didn't break. Instead, it spread. When I finally knocked on Evan's door late one Friday, he didn't look up. He was typing something casual, almost performative, as if my presence was an interruption rather than the culmination of 6 months of unwavering service. I waited a moment, then spoke as calmly as I could manage. I wanted to follow up on the bonus we discussed, and the equity. It's been almost a month now. His hand stilled briefly over the keyboard, and then he let out a small laugh-practiced, patronizing sound that told me everything before he even said a word. "Oh, that." He finally looked up, wearing the same smile he used during board meetings when dismissing concerns without saying anything directly. "Helen, you've done well really, but I think there's been a misunderstanding." My heart tightened. "A misunderstanding?" "There was never a formal agreement," he said smoothly. "No signed document. I told you we'd talk about it after the launch. Not that anything was guaranteed." His tone was light, almost amused, like we were reminiscing about a lunch reservation gone wrong. Not 6 months of my life that had nearly broken me. I wanted to speak, to push back, to remind him of the promises made behind that closed office door, but the words caught in my throat. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms like a man who knew the game was already won. "We're evaluating performance across the organization, Helen, not just one project. But truly, thank you. You've been an asset." That word asset landed like a slap. Not a leader, not a partner. An asset, a resource, disposable. I walked out of that office with a frozen smile, past the same coworkers I had covered for, mentored, defended, past the front desk where I used to drop off breakfast on Mondays, past a framed photo of our last team retreat, the one I organized and paid for out of my own pocket when the budget got slashed. I kept my head high, but inside, something was unraveling, and it only got worse. By Monday, I was removed from key email threads. Lucas, young developer I had trained, who once asked me for tips on data indexing, was now listed as the technical point of contact for Argus. The engineering lead, who had reported to me for over 2 years, was suddenly routing status updates to someone else. My access to the codebase, the one I had architected from scratch, was revoked under the guise of department restructuring. No warning, no explanation. Then came the company-wide update, a polished presentation deck, a celebration of the Argus launch, slide after slide of user metrics, interface screenshots, client testimonials, and standing in front of them all was Lucas. Hair neatly styled, buttoned down, crisp, rehearsed smile in place. He was introduced as the visionary behind our healthcare breakthrough. My name wasn't mentioned, not once. I left the conference room before the applause began. My hands trembled as I pushed open the stairwell door, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. I sat on the concrete steps for what felt like hours, not crying, not even angry, just hollow. The kind of hollow that seeps into your bones and makes you question whether you were ever really there to begin with. Later that week, I watched Lucas move into the office adjacent to Evan's. A shiny nameplate had already been installed. Lucas Reed, Innovation Lead. The title wasn't new, it was mine, unofficially, for the better part of 2 years. But now, it was etched in brass and placed on a door that should have been mine. When he passed by and greeted me with a cheery, "Hey Helen, hope it's okay they asked me to take over some of your documentation," I forced a smile so tightly it ached in my jaw. I hadn't been told anything, no memo, no email, no call. I had simply been erased. I sat at my desk, trying to remember what I'd even come in to do. Emails piled up, bug reports came in, minor updates, minor questions, and I answered them all like a ghost trying to prove she still existed. That afternoon, I discovered an internal invite for a leadership luncheon I hadn't received. Every department head was listed, except me. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred, then slowly closed the laptop and walked out without saying a word. I didn't even know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. That night, I pulled out an old photo album. Inside were pictures from my son's first year of school field days. Halloween costumes, drawings taped to our fridge. I remembered how I used to volunteer for every event, how I used to show up to every moment, and how somewhere along the way, I traded all of that for the false promise of being seen. But I hadn't just been forgotten. I had been replaced, deliberately, quietly, and completely. In the weeks that followed, I found myself moving through the halls of Brightcore like a shadow of the person I used to be. I wasn't fired, at least not officially. That would have been too loud, too risky, too obvious. Instead, I was slowly unstitched from the fabric of the company I had spent 8 years helping to hold together, like a thread pulled carefully from a quilt until nothing remained but a memory of its pattern. Each morning, I arrived earlier than anyone else, not because I had pressing tasks to finish, but because I needed quiet time to remind myself that I still had a place there, even if that place was now undefined and shrinking by the day. The coffee machine became my only companion. I'd watch the dark liquid swirl in the pot and wonder if it had more purpose than I did. Meetings were held without me. Documents I had created were edited, stripped of my initials, then redistributed under Lucas's name. I watched as phrases I had coined in sleepless strategy calls were spoken aloud by people who had once asked me to explain them. No one looked me in the eye anymore, not out of cruelty, but out of complicity. They all knew what was happening, and no one wanted to be next. They didn't avoid me because they hated me. They avoided me because I reminded them that loyalty didn't protect you, that age and illness made you expendable, that you could do everything right and still vanish. The worst part wasn't the professional betrayal, it was how deeply personal it all became. I started waking up at 4 a.m. with my heart pounding and my hands trembling, not from the chemo, but from a quiet kind of panic I couldn't name. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, playing every conversation over again, trying to pinpoint the exact moment I stopped mattering. Was it when I got sick, when I turned 50, or was it simply when I trusted the wrong person to do the right thing? There were moments when I caught myself staring blankly at my screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard, unable to remember what I was supposed to be working on. I answered every bug ticket like it still mattered, responded to design requests with a professionalism that masked the fact that I felt like a ghost haunting my own desk. Every small task became an anchor, a way to pretend that I was still needed, even as the reality around me said otherwise. It wasn't until I received a calendar alert for the upcoming company-wide presentation that something inside me truly broke. I had helped build every inch of that product, from its earliest mock-ups to its launch plan. I had walked the executives through the technical architecture in 3 separate briefings. And yet, when the lights dimmed and the slick, polished video began to play filled with smiling clients, flowing dashboards, and every buzzword marketing could cram into 90 seconds, I wasn't in a single frame. Instead, it was Lucas standing in front of my work, speaking with my cadence, using the exact diagrams I had drawn on a whiteboard 6 months earlier. He even mimicked my hand gestures. And as the room filled with the sound of polite clapping, I felt something in me go utterly, completely still. Not out of shock, I was long past being shocked, but out of a kind of hollow confirmation that I had become irrelevant, replaceable, forgotten. I didn't stay for the end. I walked out of that auditorium, down the stairwell, and straight to the parking lot without saying a word. I drove aimlessly for hours, the Colorado sky melting from deep blue to twilight, my hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were the last thing tethering me to reality. I ended up parked in front of my childhood home, the one we had sold after my mother passed, and I just sat there staring at the dark windows, remembering the way she used to hold my face when I was young and afraid, telling me, "They can take your job, your place at the table, even your name on the project, but they cannot take your worth unless you let them." That memory cracked something open inside me, because I realized in that moment that Evan hadn't just stolen credit, had stolen my reflection of it. And worse than that, I had helped him do it by shrinking, by staying silent, by trying to be agreeable in a system that had no intention of honoring my voice. The next morning, I didn't arrive early out of desperation, I arrived early out of purpose. I sat down in the break room with my laptop, but instead of answering bug reports, I opened the folder where I'd saved my early design drafts, the system maps, the architecture outlines. I pulled up Slack transcripts, email threads, prototype timelines, and for the first time in months, I began to feel something stir in my chestnut revenge. Not yet, but something deeper, something older. A sense that I had not been erased completely, not if I still had the truth in my hands. As I backed up every file, tagged every version, and labeled every artifact with care, I realized I didn't need to scream, or fight, or beg. I needed to remember. I had built this. Not Evan. Not Lucas. Me. The first time I read that legal clause, I didn't fully grasp its weight. It was buried in a bookmarked article I had saved months earlier, back when the project was still in its infancy and hope hadn't yet been poisoned by betrayal. It was a single sentence, plain and easy to overlook. In the absence of a signed IP transfer agreement, the intellectual property remains the default property of the creator. At the time, I had filed it away more out of habit than suspicion. I'd read enough contracts in my career to know that assumptions rarely protected anyone, but I still trusted Evan at least enough to believe he'd honor what we discussed. After all, who would think to exploit someone in the middle of cancer treatment? But now, with the way they had pushed me to the margins, with how they paraded my work as someone else's, I couldn't stop hearing that sentence echo in my mind, like a quiet bell in a dark hallway, distant but persistent. That morning, I returned to it not just to reread, but to understand. I pulled up everything I had: email chains, version logs, design boards, prototype drafts, Zoom transcripts, and Slack exchanges. I traced the entire build of Argus from the first conceptual sketch to the final rollout, and as I clicked through the files, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The IP agreement, the one Evan said we'd finalize later, was still sitting in the shared drive, untouched. It was labeled Draft, Helen, Jan, and the metadata confirmed it had never been signed, never uploaded, never officially executed. I stared at it for a long time, my heart beating not with fear this time, but with a sharp, growing clarity. After everything they had taken my credit, my title, my place, they had overlooked one thing: The very foundation of the product itself still legally belonged to me. It was almost laughable, the simplicity of the oversight, and yet the magnitude of what it meant began to settle in my bones like warmth returning to a numb limb. They had built a multi-million-dollar contract on a false assumption, and I was holding the key that could unravel all of it, not out of vengeance. Not yet, but because for the first time in months, I remembered that I wasn't powerless. I had been silent, but I hadn't disappeared. I called Nina Ellis, a tech attorney I had met years ago at a Women in Innovation forum in Portland. We hadn't spoken in some time, but when I explained what had happened slowly at first, then with growing urgency, her tone shifted immediately. She asked for everything. The documents, the correspondence, the timestamps. I sent her a secured folder labeled Evidence Do Not Touch and gave her full access. 2 days later, she called me back. Her voice was calm but focused, like someone who had just confirmed a fracture in a steel beam. "They're using your software without a signed IP transfer," she said plainly. "That's not just unethical, it's a liability and potentially catastrophic for them if this goes public." I sat there, gripping the phone, barely able to process what she was saying. "You're not wrong, Helen," she added. "You just forgot how powerful you are." That line hit me harder than any insult ever had, not because it was harsh, but because it was true. Somewhere between chemo sessions, missed birthdays, and constant gaslighting, I had started to believe I was small. I had shrunk myself to fit inside a system that never intended to make space for me, hoping that if I stayed quiet long enough, someone would eventually hand me the recognition I had earned. But I wasn't waiting anymore. That night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, not checking my makeup, not smoothing my hair, just looking. Not at the fatigue, or the crow's feet, or the tired eyes, but at the woman behind them, the architect, the builder, the survivor. I whispered to myself, "They thought I was done." Then I smiled, slow and steady. They have no idea what's coming. From that moment on, my energy changed. I didn't sleep much, but the sleeplessness wasn't born of anxiety anymore. It came from focus, precision, and the intoxicating clarity that comes with taking your power back. I spent every evening combing through my contributions, documenting each commit and every original concept. I mapped every interface I had designed and gathered every version file that bore my fingerprints. I cataloged the entire development journey, not as a backup, but as a weapon. And then, when Nina said the files were airtight, we didn't file a lawsuit, not yet. We sent something cleaner, sharper, quieter. A formal cease and desist, drafted with surgical precision, citing legal precedent and attached with every documented artifact we had. It was addressed directly to Evan and the Brightcore legal team, giving them 7 business days to cease use of the Argus platform or face full litigation. The letter didn't ask for money. It didn't even demand recognition. It simply stated, without emotion, that continued use of the system without my written consent constituted a violation of federal intellectual property law. It was not personal. It was business. But I knew deep down it was both. When Nina hit send, I closed my eyes and exhaled so deeply it felt like releasing months of held breath. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt rooted. For the first time in so long, I wasn't begging to be seen. I was declaring that I had never left. The reply came, not from Evan, but from Brightcore's legal counsel. It was a thinly veiled attempt to intimidate, full of vague references to scope of employment and standard practice, yet glaringly absent was the one thing that Matareta signed IP transfer. Without it, their position was as hollow as the thank yous I had once received. Nina read the letter and laughed at a short, sharp sound of satisfaction. "They're bluffing," she said. "They're stalling because they know they can't win." It was surreal to realize the same people who had once made me feel so small were now scrambling behind glass walls, trying to figure out how to contain the very person they thought they had erased. And I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The news that Brightcore had lost its biggest client swept through the industry faster than anyone expected. And though no one said it publicly, everyone knew it wasn't just a legal misstep, it was a reckoning. Evan's carefully crafted illusion of control had shattered the moment the healthcare firm signed with ClearPath Insight, my company, and in doing so, handed me back what he had once stolen so quietly. There was no press release announcing my return, no social media post celebrating justice, Just a scheduled meeting at the same office where I had once been erased. I remember the morning well, the chill in the Denver air, the way sunlight poured through the lobby glass, and the unfamiliar hush that settled over the reception area as I walked through, wearing the same heels I had once walked out in months before, though this time, I wasn't holding back tears. I was holding a leather folder with the new contract inside. The receptionist, a young woman I'd never met, looked up with wide eyes and asked if I had an appointment. I smiled gently and said, "I'm here for the transition briefing." She checked the list and nodded, her expression shifting from neutral to something more reverent, and as I stepped toward the elevators, I could feel the weight of recognition returning, not as flattery, not as apology, but as awareness. Not because they suddenly respected me, but because they realized they had underestimated someone who never needed their permission in the first place. The boardroom looked the same: glass walls, long table, minimalist decor, but the energy inside had changed. Several of the executives were new, brought in during the fallout, but a few faces were painfully familiar. I noticed Lucas seated 2 spots down, his posture stiff, eyes darting toward me and then away like someone trying to make sense of a ghost. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. I began the meeting with calm, factual authority. I laid out the migration roadmap, the security revalidation procedures, the restructuring of access permissions, and the reintegration timeline. There were no accusations, no bitterness, just competence, clarity, and presence. The new leadership team listened, nodded, and asked detailed questions. I answered all of them without notes, because this system was still mine, not just in code or design, but in origin, in intention, in every decision etched into its architecture. When I finished, one of the new senior advisors leaned forward, his voice low but direct. "We should have worked with you from the beginning." I looked at him for a moment and replied with quiet confidence, "You still can." There was no satisfaction in watching Evan's name be removed from the company directory. No twisted pleasure in knowing the office he once occupied was now dark and empty. What I felt wasn't revenge, it was release. I had carried the weight of being invisible for so long that simply standing in that room as myself, without justification or apology, felt like victory enough. In the weeks that followed, ClearPath Insight began to grow, not explosively, but with purpose. I built a small team, people who cared more about the integrity of the work than the credit that came with it. We didn't work late chasing optics or burn hours fighting for internal status. We built clean code, honest systems, and meaningful partnerships. And though I still had days when fatigue reminded me that my body was healing, I also had mornings when I looked in the mirror and saw someone whole again. I no longer needed Brightcore's validation. I no longer needed to prove that I mattered, because the truth was I always had. I just stopped believing it when they stopped saying it out loud. One evening, after a long day reviewing implementation cycles and finalizing a new service proposal, I picked up my son from school. As we pulled into the driveway, he glanced at me and said, "You don't seem tired like before. Are you happy now?" I looked at him, smiled, and said, "I think I finally remember who I am. Because that's the real win it. The contract. Not the title. Not even the fact that I had turned the tables on the very people who tried to erase me. The real win was reclaiming something far more powerful. My own reflection." Brightcore received the termination letter the same morning I received the signed contract. According to someone still inside, the announcement hit Evan like a bullet through frosted glass, sudden, irreversible, and deafening. He stormed out of a board meeting that afternoon, the once celebrated $3 million deal now officially dead, dissolved by a single overlooked clause, and the woman he thought had quietly faded away. Within 2 days, the company issued an internal statement about organizational realignment and strategic leadership changes. No farewell email, no thank you post. Just a cleared out office, a missing nameplate, and silence. Evan Merrill gone. I didn't celebrate, not out loud, but inside, something began to settle like the stillness after a storm when the ground, though drenched, feels firm again beneath your feet. I hadn't needed to destroy what they built, I just had to build something better. For the first time in years, I felt not vindicated but restored. A week later, I walked through the glass doors of that same building, not as a disgraced employee trying to be seen, but as the CEO of ClearPath Insight, the company now contracted to lead the continued development and support of the Argus platform. The lobby looked the same, but everything had changed. People stared, some in disbelief, Others with the kind of quiet respect that doesn't need to be spoken aloud. Even Lucas, who passed me with a hesitant nod, couldn't mask the shock on his face. I led the meeting that day from the head of the table. No raised voices, no petty power moves, just clarity, professionalism, and direction. The new board members asked thoughtful questions. I answered them thoroughly. At the end of the session, one of the senior advisors leaned forward, folded his hands, and said, "We should have worked with you from the start." I met his eyes, nodded once, and replied, "You still can." And I meant it. Because I wasn't there to punish the system, I was there to replace it with something more just. In the months that followed, ClearPath grew slowly but steadily. We earned new contracts, built a team of people who cared more about what we were building than how loudly they could take credit for it, and fostered a culture where experience was valued and integrity wasn't a punchline. At home, things changed, too. My energy wasn't endless. I was still healing, but I had begun to feel like myself again. One night, as I tucked my son into bed, he looked up and said, "You smile more now, Mom." I kissed his forehead, smoothed the blanket, and whispered back, "That's because I remember who I am again." Even now, there are moments when I pass the old office tower and catch a glimpse of my own reflection in the glass otter, wiser, not unscarred, but undiminished. And I remind myself that I am not invisible anymore, not because someone finally saw me, but because I finally stopped waiting for permission to be seen. Too many of us give years, sometimes decades, to places that were never meant to hold us. We shrink ourselves for comfort, for peace, for hope that someone will recognize the value we keep proving over and over. But the truth is, you don't need a title to own your worth. You don't need applause to validate your impact. And you certainly don't need permission to take back what was always yours. All you need is that one quiet moment of courage, that one decision to stop waiting and start rebuilding. Have you ever been overlooked, replaced, or underestimated only to rise again, stronger than before? Share your story in the comments below. You never know who might find strength in your voice. Jaden, if this story moved you, consider subscribing to the Underdog's Revenge. We share true, powerful stories of resilience, justice, and second chances. Your comeback might just be next.